All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. We're going to give everybody a chance to get in here and join us. So, everyone, just be patient as we roll in with all of the participants. So happy that you guys could join us. Today is October 22nd. We are covering the topic of Amazon buyer seller messaging and communicating with your customers. More directly, we're covering the topic of the change that will be implemented on November 3rd. This is the change that is being implemented by Amazon, not the larger change that could potentially be happening with America voting. Why Amazon picked the dates, I think it's just a total coincidence. Um, but welcome to everybody. I would love for you to just tell us you're here in the chat. Tell us your name. Tell us, well, actually, I'll know your name if you chat. Tell us where you're from. And, most importantly, I have a Q&A tab that you should be able to see. And within the Q&A tab, that's your opportunity to ask questions. And we are expecting a lot of questions. The last time we did this webinar, which was around the 10th or so of September, we spent over 30 minutes working on just the questions that came from everybody. So we've designed this webinar. We have designed this webinar specifically to give you guys information, but more importantly, to really dive into some of the questions that you guys have. So, Will, you're winning so far for where you're from. Will's response, Jennifer, was that his mom says he's from heaven. Um, yeah, you got to like that one, right? So thank you all for joining. Again, today is about answering your questions. So if you have questions, please post those in the Q&A, not in the chat. It's really difficult for us to follow the chat. It's a lot easier for us to follow the questions. It gives me a format for making sure that we answer them. And we're going to attempt to answer every question that you guys ask. And so we know that there's a lot of detailed information and a lot of specifics to your particular account. We've had a few of you email in questions before this started. So let's dive into today's data. My name is Jeff Cohen. I'm the VP of Marketing with Seller Labs. I've been with Seller Labs for about 6 years now, been in e-commerce since about 2005. But I want to introduce you to Jennifer Dare if you haven't had the chance to meet her. So Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Dare. I'm a product manager here at Seller Labs, and I've been here about 2 years. And I'm a product manager over a lot of things in Seller Labs Pro, but particularly the communication center. And that's something we're going to be touching on today.
Yeah, you're probably going to see more and more from Jennifer. I'm going to force her to do more and more of these because Jennifer's doing a lot of really cool work that's going to be revamping a lot of the value of Pro and our dashboard and our new product page that's come out and our new notification center and all these other really cool things. We're not getting into that specifically today, but you'll be seeing more from Jennifer as we roll out some of these new features and new functionality within the tool. And it's always great to have one of the product managers on this call with us because Jennifer has the opportunity, along with myself, to sit on the calls with Amazon as we've been discussing these conversations and these updates. And one of the things that I think is different about this update compared to other updates is that because of our relationship with Amazon and being part of some of the different committees and groups that we're part of, we've been able to very specifically ask Amazon questions. We actually had some input into the policy before it went live. So we've gotten a lot of clarification around things, which allows me to very confidently tell you what we believe is true and what we believe is false, or what we still don't know the answer to. And Jennifer and I laugh about that all the time, that there's still things that we don't know the answer to. So quick agenda for today. We're going to talk about the update on September 8th, which is effective November 3rd. We're going to talk about what it means for you. I'm going to have Jennifer kind of go through what we've done at Seller Labs. Like, what have we done to help you? And then what do you need to do? And we'll talk about some best practices. Okay, so for those that are not aware, Amazon posted these guidelines on September 8th. They go into effect November 3rd. Now, what's really interesting about this in comparison to other things that have happened with Amazon is that Amazon typically posts new policy changes. It's very rare for Amazon to post that a new policy change is coming and give it an effective date. And so what that means to us, and what we kind of took away from that, is that Amazon is going to be um, really looking at this policy update and enforcing it starting November 3rd. And so they've given you kind of this window, this time to get yourself cleaned up so that you can ensure that you don't have any violations of the new policy. Okay, so let's go through kind of like some of the highlights of the policy and like what all it means. One of the things that I think was really interesting about the policy was that they said very specifically you can ask for reviews. And so Amazon in the past has never really said what you can do. They give some best practices and things like that. But in this policy update, they actually use the language and say that you can ask for reviews. And we think this is awesome. We're a little biased in the fact that we have an email system for asking for reviews. But we think this is awesome because it's been controversial and it's been a question for a lot of sellers for a long time about whether I can ask for reviews. One thing you will hear us say numerous times throughout this presentation is just because you can do it doesn't mean there are or are not ways to do it right and wrong. And so what we want to help you understand is how to do it correctly. And you can use our system, and there are still ways you can use our system and be wrong. So you still have an onus on you. We're not completely responsible as the system provider, and we'll get into that here. Again, they said you can use third-party approved tools. And so what is a third-party approved tool? The way it was defined within Amazon system is one that is using their protocols for communicating with customers. So we have to follow certain rules and guidelines to have access to the technology that we use. And then we get approved into what's called the Amazon App Store. And so that's kind of Amazon's like vetting system, if you will, for which tools are approved and which are not. And it's really cool because this is the first time Amazon has just flat come out said what you can do, right? And they talked about this idea of permitted messages versus proactive messages. And I don't want to get into every one of these. Caroline has posted into the chat the link that will get you to this. But this is a nice little chart that we thought was a good way to be able to kind of see all of this information and understand what is considered a permitted message and what is considered a proactive message. And more importantly, they also get into what's not allowed. And we'll get into a little bit of that as well. And so the first thing that they tell you is that if you're going to use permitted or proactive messages, there's essentially a couple of ways to do it, using third-party tools or doing it directly through the buyer-seller messaging. So remember, Amazon does not want you to communicate with their sellers, their buyers outside of the Amazon system. One of the other big changes, and I don't want to go through every point, but I want to point out some of the big changes, is that Amazon has, for the first time, come out and said that it needs to be within 30 days of the order. And so you'll actually see a change that we've made in the Seller Lab system to ensure that orders over 30 days don't get messages. But that is new, and Amazon had not had that policy in the past. And then they put in two pieces of requirement that we, as the service provider, will take care of for you. So the email has to include the order ID, and it needs to be sent in what they call the buyer's language of preference. Now, just to explain, and we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but just to explain, that doesn't mean that you have to write an email for every language that somebody could potentially speak. If you're selling in North America, the language of preference are either English or Spanish. If you're selling in France, the language of preference is French. And so for each country that Amazon sells in, they have preferred languages that people can select from. And we are taking on that responsibility to ensure that the language of preference is being used correctly, as well as the order ID. And so we're taking on a little of this, and we need you guys to take on a little of this. So what is important from this whole thing is to make sure that you're sending messages that are deemed proactive when you're sending them, and making sure that you're not just sending random messages that have no value or meaning. Okay, what happens if you violate part of this policy? You move into what Amazon terms, and I'm using Amazon terminology here on purpose, called a programmatic restriction. And so a programmatic restriction is basically programmatic, meaning that the computer is identifying you as causing a problem and giving you a restriction. A lot of people have used the word suspension, but it's not a suspension. So your account is not impacted in any way. You are just restricted in your ability to send messages using the buyer-seller messaging system. You cannot initiate messages, but if somebody is to message you, you can reply to those messages. If you need to send what Amazon deems as an important message, that's the one with the brackets around it, even if you're restricted, you can still send important messages. Now, I will send out a warning, and that warning is that if you misuse the important tag, then you could set your account up for an actual account suspension. Okay. So you can do things that will lead to an account suspension if you continue to violate the policy. The first time you're restricted, it's a 30-day restriction. You'll get an email notification from Amazon telling you that you're restricted. If you happen to violate it again, the restriction is lifetime. And I'll get into that in a second, but it's lifetime. None of this impacts your ability to sell. None of this impacts your ability to reply to a buyer message. And of course, there's also an additional feature that Amazon and Seller Labs has called Request a Review, that if you're ever under any type of restriction, you can use the Request a Review feature, and you can send out an Amazon templated message to ask for a review. There's a lot of differences, and Caroline can possibly grab a blog post that we've done on Request a Review versus buyer-seller messaging, which will show you the differences between the two. So before I jump into this, I want to cover one last thing, and that is if you get a lifetime restriction, it is nearly impossible to get that lifted. I have tried to work with several clients to get their lifetime restriction removed, and I have not been successful yet. I have heard of one or two people who have been, but Amazon is being very strict in saying, hey, we gave you a warning. We gave you an opportunity. You didn't fix it. Sorry. So if you get a restriction, take it seriously and take action. So Jennifer, I wanted you to kind of come in here and chat about what we've done to help our sellers be compliant. And I think we broke this down into a couple of different ways. So do you want to kind of go through these, Jennifer?
Sure, that's no problem. So we did break it down in two ways. What do you do with existing messages that you've already created in the communication center? And then we'll talk next about how we will help you make messages going forward. And this is a little bit in the weeds. You can see we have a lot of things. But what we've done is we've been able to screen existing messages to look for these violations. We can't screen for everything. And it's certainly important that every person that has messages checks them to make sure that they are compliant. But what we can do is detect those that have this list of issues on the left-hand side of the screen, and we can identify which messages in particular have those, and we're going to alert you via the notification center in our product and via email so that you know you've violated one of these policies. They're mostly around formatting. Formatting is something that is a big push for this update, and some of them are around what you've included as well. So we're able to screen for all of these things, but what we can't detect, it's important to know, we can't tell what the intent of a message is. So if you're sending a message that really doesn't meet the requirements of a proactive required message for order completion, we're not going to know that. So that's something you're going to have to look for. Obviously, grammar and spelling errors, especially with multiple languages, that's not something that we're capable of screening every message for. And then one thing we're able to look for in the message body itself is the use of non-secure URLs. But again, if you have a URL in your logo, we're not going to be able to look for that. And then the content and style of attachments is something that we're unable to screen for. But everything that we can screen for is on the left, and we're going to be notifying on a message by message basis to let you know that you have a message that may be in violation of one of these changes.
Yeah. And so you'll be seeing those notifications coming through the notification center inside Pro. And we'll also be pushing those notifications out via email. Do you have a general sense of when people should start to see the
Yeah.
screening of existing messages?
Yep, we are already screening them, and we're going to be able to send notifications out sometime next week via both the platform and via email. So you'll know that for every message that you've created, every template that you're using, that you've customized, we will be able to let you know if any of these things were detected in your messages.
Yeah. And so Sharon asked a good question. She said, does that mean everything on the left is considered prohibited? I would say everything on this page is considered prohibited. We just can only help detect and identify certain things, and you will need to identify others. I want to be very clear. Seller Labs does not have an obligation to be doing any of this. Right. We are proactively doing this to kind of help our customers to understand when they have a violation or a potential violation. Some of you may choose to fix these things, and some of you may choose to ignore these things. You are the ones responsible for your messages and what you send. We are responsible for really only two things. We're responsible for ensuring that your message is sent in the buyer language of choice and that it has the order ID. We just felt that to make things easier on you, that we would build in some technology to help you screen existing messages and some technology to help you when creating new messages to know when you potentially are violating the policy. There are sellers who may choose to violate the policy. We don't recommend it, but we'll continue to notify you if we find messages that are violating the policy. So Claudia was asking, what does it mean to have a non-secure URL?
We're going to talk a little bit more about URLs in a minute, but non-secure URLs in Amazon's policy are those that do not begin with an HTTPS.
Yeah, that's the easiest way to know.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we've also built a little bit of technology into the way new messages are created. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So what we've done is we've removed things that you could use to create a violation. For example, we had an emoji tool. You used to be able to add emojis to your messages, but you can't anymore. And so we removed the tool and made some other changes to the editing tools to try to minimize the potential to create a message that's not compliant. We've also removed what we called the product image variable, and that was like you would include an image of the product that was purchased. Amazon's automatically including that in the messages, and so we can no longer include it on our side. And we're also, as Jeff mentioned, including the order ID, which is a new requirement with every message. And then when you violate or make changes that could potentially be a formatting issue, and again, we can't catch every single one, but things like number of fonts, spacing, things that are style issues, we're warning you to correct them before you can create your template and save it. Again, also Jeff mentioned we eliminated options that are greater than 30 days. And then we are supporting the buyer's language. So we've connected to Amazon's API. So we know the preferred language of every buyer if they've identified it in Amazon. Otherwise, it's the default language for the marketplace. And then when you create messages, you're going to be able to add the language. So you can have a message and say, this message is Spanish. And it will be noted in our database so that when we get an order in and we see the order buyer's preference, we can send the appropriate message based on that.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit more about buyer language messaging here in a second, because we've also done some additional technology to kind of help you when you don't have the language of choice. But I think what's really cool, and this is all kind of rolling out over time, like time in like the next week or so. But as you are creating new messages, you get big warnings on the page that are kind of telling you. And so while in your old messages, you need to be notified and you need to go and you need to remove things to be compliant. In your new messages, we won't even let you do them. And so one question that I know gets asked, and I want to I want to just address it outright, which is, well, why don't you just go change my old messages? Jennifer, do you want to kind of attack that?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we can't really go in and change old messages is because we don't know necessarily the intent, right? And so we don't want to create a message that's incorrect. So we need everyone to go in and review their messages themselves. And I think also we just can't be sure that we've screened for absolutely everything that the terms call for. So it's best to just go back and review your messages.
Yeah, I think that, when it comes down to it, if we just went back into your messages and started stripping this stuff out, like your messages wouldn't be the way you want them to be.
That's
And
right.
the beauty of our system is that it was designed to have templates to get you started, or it is designed to have templates to get you started, but you can customize those to your own business. And
Mhm.
like we said, there are some customers who may choose to continue to do things that are violations and they want to take that risk. We have an obligation moving forward to make sure that our tool doesn't let you do that. But you have the obligation to go in and make the changes to your account. We are not responsible for the messages that you send. We are only responsible for ensuring that those messages have an order ID and are sent in the buyer's language of choice. And so a lot of times people say, I got suspended because I used Feedback Genius. No, you got suspended because you did something wrong in your messaging, and your messaging happened to come from Seller Labs. Right? That there's a big difference in that, and it's important for everybody to understand. If you're really concerned, once these changes all roll out, we'll be posting updates over the next 2 weeks. Once these changes all roll out, you could just go create new messages. That might be one way that you want to do it versus going back and updating old messages. So there's a lot of different options for you to choose from. Okay, so what do you need to do to stay compliant? Let's go through some best practices, and then I've already got a ton of questions, and they're great ones. So first, only send one message. So this is still controversial. And this is where I just say, like, go to best practices, send one message. If you're trying to convince yourself that you have a unique situation that allows you to send more than one message, you're probably trying to game the system. If you really do have a reason for sending more than one message, because you have two proactive messages you should send, it's okay. It's not a violation, right? There is no hard rule of sending one message, but the recommendation is to send one message.
And Jeff, worth noting that we should never send more than one request for feedback or review. So no matter what, you can only send that one time.
Yeah. We talked a little bit about the important tag. Again, if you use this tag incorrectly, it can lead to an account suspension. So ensure that what message you're sending is actually important. So let's explain why. When you use this tag, what it does is it bypasses Amazon's system and it sends it to more people. And so important is kind of saying, like, hey, this is really important. I've got a product coming to your house and I need somebody to be home for delivery. Or I think one of the examples Amazon gave us was, you're shipping chocolate, and if it sits outside, it's going to melt, right? Like, it's important. It's part of the customer experience. You can use the tag. You want to get into the suggestive language a little bit, Jennifer?
Sure. So I think the best example of this, the one that I think is probably the one they're looking for most, is we see messages that say, like, if you tried our product and didn't like it or had a problem, email us. But if you loved it, leave a review. And you're suggesting which action to take based on your experience, and that is not permitted by Amazon.
Yeah, we boiled it down to what we called the if-then statement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if anything ever has an if-then, then you probably have suggestive language. Now, this is one that always gets me, that people still don't fully understand how about the use of promotions and coupons, but they're not to be used. There's just there is no black and white, and the easiest way to explain it to sellers is to say that communication should be about the product that somebody bought. So a promotion or a coupon is trying to get them to buy an additional product. That is not the intent of what the buyer seller messaging should be used for. I always like this one because people try to get tricky with external links. and it was funny. I tried to use this in an Amazon presentation and they made me take it out because I was trying to give everybody my email address. But don't don't try to get tricky in how you have external links. So the actual use of external links is not against terms of service. The inclusion of an email address or a website is, but I had somebody ask this question last night and I answered just in case they didn't make it today. But like, let's say you have a video on how to use your product and you want to send people to it. Well, if you send them to your website, you're sending them to an external link. They're going to get a big box that pops up and says you're leaving Amazon and going to an external link. My recommendation is that you load that video into what's called the related videos. So under Seller Central, you now have an upload video tab. I actually think it sits under inventory. It's kind of weird that it sits under inventory, but I think it sits under video under inventory. It's an upload video tab. Put it there. Then you'll get a URL for that video. And then you can include that link in your email so that you're sending them to Amazon to watch the video you want them to see.
Yeah, and this is where the no URLs that are other than HTTPS comes into play. So that's no matter where you're sending them, that has to at least be the minimum.
They made a few changes around attachments. Jennifer, do you want to kind of cover those?
Yeah, I think generally what I'd say about attachments is that they're basically the same requirements as you have around your messages in terms of grammar, styling. You want to make sure that you're following all the same rules. But I think that there are 3 attachments that are okay. And I think it's best to avoid any other besides these 3. So you want potentially to send product instructions, warranty information, or an invoice. And you don't want to get creative and tricky with sticking other things under the header of warranty and then promoting something or showing other products. So you want to be really careful about following the rules. And those are probably the only 3 attachments that you would consider sending.
Yeah, what's interesting is that really start of like the first of the year, Amazon got really strict in applying the enforcement of all these policies. And so my guess is that they started really enforcing these policies and then they realized they needed to improve the policies so that everyone had a better understanding of the policies and what they were and how they worked. And now they're coming out with a new policy, which means they'll come out with even more enforcement. So just because you got away with something in the past doesn't mean you'll get away with it in the future. One recommendation I've made to people is if you're knowingly violating any of these and you choose to not update, make sure you are keeping a close eye on any notification from Amazon that comes that says you've been put on a 30-day restriction. Because if you miss that, and a lot of people who end up on the lifetime restriction have said, I didn't see the notification come in that I was on a 30-day ban. We don't get any notification. We've asked them for that. We would love for them to come back and tell us that you've been given a 30-day restriction. We are given no indication of that. So you are responsible for knowing when that happens. You want to talk about emojis? We always find this one funny.
I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. We cannot include emojis or GIFs in our messages any longer. I know it was sort of a sad thing for us because we had recently added the ability to add emojis, and it's very popular now with emails. But this is an Amazon requirement.
Yeah, and we actually asked Amazon, and it was kind of a funny conversation because we're like, emojis are basically the way people talk. So why can we not use emojis? And they didn't really have an answer. They just don't want people using emojis.
And again, we don't recommend getting creative and sticking an image file of an emoji in your message.
Right. And you want to talk a little bit about the design standards, because we built a lot of technology into adhering to design standards, primarily because they're kind of hard for individuals to follow, right? There's a lot of weird ones like the amount of spacing and the amount of fonts and things like that.
That's something we are able to warn about. Amazon's had a set of rules around font color and things like that for a long time, and those haven't changed, but there are some more specifics around what you're allowed to do. And the standards that we've addressed in the product and that you need to consider is margin width. There's a limit on the margins that you have. They cannot be greater than 20% of your message size. I'm sure that's hard to measure, so just keep margins, just be mindful of margins, I think is the key. The image sizes is something that they're following. Fonts that are more than 3 sizes in one message is forbidden. We're able to actually prevent that in our product as well. And then also alignment. So you can no longer have a center aligned or a right justified content. You've got to use left justify as well. So those are some funky design requirements that we've had to modify the product to make sure we're enforcing.
Yeah. And I think, people always say why. Well, I think Amazon just wants some standards of what's going out from everybody. And it got kind of crazy of everybody having their own HTML and using different fonts and big sizes and all these kind of crazy things. So Amazon, one bad apple spoils the bunch, and now requires us all to follow. Okay, so we had a couple of questions earlier about request a review. Can you talk a little bit about how Seller Labs uses request a review in conjunction with the buyer-seller messaging, and in conjunction with the language of choice,
Sure.
And how we kind of are helping to ensure that every message gets sent and that we follow compliant rules?
That's right. So as Jeff said, we don't want to send a request a review using the automated tool. So Seller Labs Pro and Basic have a tool where you can automate this, where you can automatically send an Amazon templated request a review for every order. So that's something you can do in Seller Central, but this is not on an order by order basis. You can automate this in the product. We also obviously don't want to send at the same time a custom message that's requesting for a review. And then we have on top of that, this language requirement. So if a buyer has a preferred language and you have a message, a custom message template that's in that language, we will send that custom message. If a buyer has a language preference that you do not have a message for, we will then instead send an Amazon templated request a review. We'll make sure that the buyer gets a message that they're presented with this, but Amazon's API ensures that the request a review is in the proper language for the buyer.
Yeah, so it's kind of us using Amazon's system as a backup in case you don't have
Right.
that language of choice. And you guys are piling up questions, so we're gonna recap here, and then we're gonna dive into your questions. So my recap is to give yourself 30 minutes to review your messages. Starting next week, or starting within the next week, you'll be getting notifications from us for any messages that might be violating the policy. Those will also show up within your tool, and we'll continue to notify you of those over time. So if you don't address them immediately, you'll still be warned. You can reference back to the blog article that we have or to this presentation for best practices. And then in addition to that, if you need more help, contact our customer support, right? So our customer support is there. The one thing that my customer support loves for me to share with you is that they are not Amazon. They are not Amazon. So they can tell you what they believe is right and what they believe is wrong, but they are not judge and jury. Amazon is. And so if, this is where they're always going to err on the side of caution and making sure that they're pushing you in the right direction.